This video delves into the Mitchell-Hedges skull, the most famous of all crystal skulls. It is named after the British adventurer Frederick Mitchell-Hedges, who allegedly discovered it in 1924 amidst the ruins of a Mayan city. In the previous part of this series, we discussed the optical peculiarities of this relic. Some claim that the skull even stores images within it. Today we'll explore this further by examining the research of Frank Dorland. Later we'll uncover the purpose behind the creation of the skull, and why it is unlikely to be a modern forgery. Lastly, things will get eerie as we learn about the inspiration for the crystal skull. Frank Dorland was an engineer and a renowned conservator and restorer. He was the first to conduct a scientific analysis of the Mitchell-Hedges skull. Between 1964 and 1970, Dorland studied the skull, collaborating in his final year with a research team from Hewlett-Packard. Their findings served as a foundation for further investigations. Dorland examined the skull using optical and electron microscopic methods, observing no signs of modern tools or polishing techniques. Instead, it appeared the skull had been shaped by slow grinding over an extended period. Dorland concluded that its creation must have been extremely time-consuming. He estimated the crystal artifact to be several thousand years old. At the heart of Dorland's research were fascinating optical phenomena, discovered entirely by chance. One evening, after a long day of analysis, Dorland set the skull by the fireplace instead of putting it back in its usual place. That's when he noticed something extraordinary, the unique way the firelight refracted through the skull's eyes. Picking it up and changing its position, he observed additional optical effects. When light struck the skull at certain angles, spectacular prismatic effects appeared. The light split into its spectral colors, creating a rainbow visible either inside the skull or projected onto its surroundings. Remarkably, incoming light sometimes created the illusion of motion within the skull, as if it were alive or contained a crystal brain at work. The intensity of this illusion varied depending on the viewing angle. Additionally, the skull could concentrate and focus light, much like a magnifying glass. This produced either a glowing point on the crystal's surface or a beam of light seemingly emanating from the skull. Under candlelight or when exposed to a faint light source, images or scenes became visible inside the skull. These images could only be seen when looking through the right eye socket. Dorland and other observers reported seeing faces, landscapes, symbols, pyramids, and even what seemed to be countless miniature skulls emerging from the crystal. Dorland also noticed something else, two differently sized holes at the base of the skull, invisible when it was upright. These holes seemed to serve a purpose. Experimenting, Dorland inserted rods into the openings. A rod in the larger hole anchored the crystal skull, while a rod in the smaller hole acted as a pivot, allowing the skull to rotate in any direction. Dorland immediately recognized the practical use of these holes for ritual purposes. Given the skull's Mayan origin, he speculated that priests may have used rods to manipulate the skull from beneath an altar. We've already discussed how the skull could glow, split light into spectral colors, or project images depending on the angle of view. With the skull's ability to rotate, someone beneath the altar could create these effects intentionally. Imagine how awe-inspiring such a spectacle must have been for the ancient Maya, especially when combined with the mind-altering substances often used in their rituals. In the previous video on the Mitchell-Hedges skull, we mentioned that this crystal skull is the only known specimen with a detachable jaw. Until then, the purpose of this feature remained an archaeological mystery. If Dorland's theory is correct, the detachable jaw also makes sense. Mounted on an additional rod, the jaw could have been manipulated to make the skull appear to speak while projecting its eerie images. The voice, of course, would have come from a priest beneath the altar. Piece by piece, the evidence paints a coherent picture. Mayan deities were often represented as skulls, suggesting that these deities were invoked and imitated using the crystal skull during religious ceremonies. The religious significance also explains why the skull had to be made of crystal. The mass-produced stone skulls found among indigenous cultures would have been far too mundane. In summary, the rods and detachable jaw strongly suggest that the skull served as a divine oracle, an oracle whose impact was greatly enhanced by the projection of images and rainbows. This idea of using crystal objects for oracles has transcended cultures. Consider the crystal balls of fortune tellers in our own traditions. These also serve as oracles, bringing scenes to life within the crystal. After these revelations, let's briefly reflect on the skull's authenticity. Critics often claim that crystal skulls are nothing more than modern fakes created to generate money and attention. A glance at the English Wikipedia entries suggests the same for the Mitchell-Hedges skull, but without in-depth analysis or evidence. Based on the information presented so far, such claims seem implausible. If someone were to forge an ancient artifact for profit, why would they create a skull with a detachable jaw, adding countless hours of work? Wouldn't they simply produce the skull in one piece, like all other known crystal skulls? If the skull was designed as a speaking oracle, however, there was no alternative but to make it exactly this way. One thing is certain, the skull has been known since at least the 1920s, and even proponents of the forgery hypothesis date its creation to the late 19th century. Today, the skull's optical properties are breathtaking. Imagine how much more astonishing they would have been in earlier times. If we assume that the finest opticians of the 19th century crafted the skull, it would have been a high-tech masterpiece of its era. Now imagine how expensive it would be to produce something at the cutting edge of technology today. While we can't calculate the exact cost, it would undoubtedly be exorbitant. So, why would anyone commission such an expensive high-tech creation, only to sell it for the same price as any other crystal skull? A roughly hewn skull would have sufficed as an ancient find. Moreover, no one would go to such lengths without highlighting or demonstrating its incredible properties, as that's what would make it a global sensation worth millions. Waiting for these features to be accidentally discovered by a fireplace 100 years later would hardly have been part of the plan. If the skull's unique qualities were to be showcased, the opportunity existed during a British Museum investigation in the 1930s. The skull was deemed genuinely ancient because no modern tool marks were found. Yet the optical intricacies went unnoticed and unmentioned. Would forgers go to the trouble of arranging such an evaluation if their goal was merely profit? Moreover, the skull wasn't publicized in spiritualist circles, offered as a fairground attraction, sold to museums, or featured in press articles. Its owners seemingly had no idea of its secret capabilities and were certainly not forgers aiming for maximum profit. This has already been a lot to cover, but the most fascinating part is yet to come. In the previous video, we discussed the theory that this relatively small crystal piece was modeled after a woman's skull. Frank Dorland didn't just study the skull, he meditated with it, as was fashionable in the 60s. Strangely, during his meditations, he often envisioned the face of a young woman. When someone suggested reconstructing the face behind the skull, Dorland was immediately enthusiastic. He wanted to see what the person looked like. Facial reconstruction is widely used in archaeology and forensic science. It has revealed Cleopatra's likeness and helps law enforcement create composite sketches of unidentified victims. What made this case unique was that the underlying skull was made of crystal. Otherwise, the process was standard. The team included a physical anthropology expert from the University of Oklahoma, an anthropologist from the Smithsonian Institution, and a composite sketch artist from the New York Police Department. Their initial findings confirmed that the crystal skull wasn't an artistic interpretation of a human skull, but an exact replica of a real one. Through painstaking work, the team eventually reconstructed the face of the individual to whom the skull once belonged. Unsurprisingly, it turned out to be a woman, one with distinctively indigenous features. The left side of the image shows the reconstructed face. On the right is a drawing by Dorland, depicting the woman he had envisioned during his meditations, long before the anthropology team began their work. The resemblance is astonishing. We may never understand the source of Dorland's visions, or why the Mitchell-Hedges skull is an exact replica of an indigenous woman's skull. Nevertheless, this legendary artifact story has gained yet another compelling chapter. This concludes the second video on the Mitchell-Hedges Crystal Skull, but it won't be the last. If you've enjoyed this so far, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.